Hi everyone, Carl Steele here. My first video on Equianos Interesting Narrative, just talking about the first quarter of the book, Questions of Self and Group Identity. This is for Brooklyn College, Spring 2020 English 413 and 4114. So a little bit just on the title, he calls it, of course, The Interesting Narrative. That's not an unusual title for 18th century English books. We have works, here's something that looks like a novel, The Interesting Narrative of the Life and Adventures of David Doubtful. We have travel literature, An Interesting Narrative of the Travels of James Bruce, Esquire, into Abyssinia to discover the source of the Nile, which I have pictured over here. We also have works of sea adventure, An Interesting Narrative of the Voyage, Shipwreck, and Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. Drake Morris, and so on. It seems to be often used for fiction, for history, for travel especially. And so that's something to just bear in mind. The thing I do want to talk about at more length, however, is the question of Equianos' birth and birthplace. So he says that he's born in West Africa and provides a detailed description of that in the first two chapters of the book. And people have identified this as an Igbo region, IGBO, in what's now modern-day Nigeria. But the difficulty here is that there are two documents that Vincent Coretta turned up. One is a record of his joining naval service in 1773 for Constantine Phipps' voyage to the Arctic, and another is a baptismal record, which is from an earlier period from February 9th, 1759 for St. Margaret's Church, Westminster in London. And both of these say that Equiano is not born in Africa, but rather that he's born in the Carolinas in North America. The question, of course, is whether or not we have to believe those documents. And what I'd like to see is some comparison to see if there are other enslaved Black people who are baptized in England in the 1750s and 1760s, people that we know incontrovertibly to have been born in Africa, and whether or not those baptismal records indicate that they are. So people, of course, have argued against Vincent Coretta's findings and said, no, that he is misunderstanding the documents. He doesn't understand the rhetorical occasion of them. Perhaps they were falsified because certainly in 1759, Equiano's mastery of English had not yet arrived. He wasn't, he probably wouldn't have had that much English if he was born in Africa. So this is, all these arguments are quite interesting and they have to be acknowledged, and I encourage you to look into them. What's more interesting to me here, perhaps, is the way that Vincent Coretta uses a word that I think is a little troubling to describe this situation. So if Equiano was in fact born in North America, and if indeed the first two books of his interesting narrative are not necessarily the story of Equiano himself, then we have something like this, according to Coretta. If they are accurate, if these two records are accurate, then he must have invented his African birth and thus his much quoted account of the Middle Passage on a slave ship. So is invented, in fact, the right verb there? I pose that question because while Equiano may or may not have been born in West Africa, and he may or may not have undergone the Middle Passage, of course, many other people did. And Equiano would have known people who were born in Africa and were enslaved, and people had gone through the Middle Passage. So saying that he invented these things, I think, doesn't really give us an adequate picture of the kind of conversations that Equiano would have been having with other enslaved people, and the way that he could have taken this material and turned it into his own story in order to make it effectively part of the book that he was writing. It's so that he is essentially telling his own story and other people's story simultaneously, because as we see in reading this book, the way Equiano presents it is simultaneously a story of his own personal adventures and of his own personal spiritual encounter with God, but also the story of someone who is simply representative of other people. So you have, in the very beginning of this work, people generally think those memoirs only worthy to be read are remembered, which abound in great or striking events, those, in short, which in a high degree excite either admiration or pity. All others they consign to contempt in oblivion. It is therefore, I confess, not a little hazardous in a private and obscure individual, notice how he talks about himself, and a stranger too, a stranger to England, that is, thus to solicit the indulgent attention of the public, especially when I offer here the history of neither a saint, a hero, nor a tyrant. I believe there are few events in my life which have not happened to many. So he is saying essentially that my story is worth telling, not because I'm a particularly special person, but rather because I am a representative person, that my experience is something that's shared by many people. So there's a sense in which, although this is the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, it is also the interesting narrative of enslaved African people who have undergone the conditions of the Middle Passage in general. And indeed, that's one of the primary reasons I think that this book is so widely read these days, not because of Equiano himself, but rather because of what Equiano represents. So he also goes on to say, in this early part of the book, I might say my sufferings were great, but when I compare my lot with that of most of my countrymen, I regard myself as a particular favorite of heaven and acknowledge the mercies of Providence in every occurrence of my life. In fact, he's saying that what I've undergone here is nowhere near as bad as what other people have undergone. And indeed, that is certainly true because, of course, not only was he able to obtain his freedom, but he was also able to write a book about it, able to make a significant amount of money on this, able to marry, able to live eventually in relative peace and, comfortable prosperity. And certainly most people who had undergone what he'd undergone did not end so well. In fact, they tended to end in conditions of appalling deprivation and early death. So he also says here on page 61 in the Penguin edition, "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would have men should do unto you? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice?" So notice again how he's speaking about himself here, not as an individual, but in this case as an African, as a representative of a larger people. So when Vincent Coretta says that Equiano has invented his story of the Middle Passage and of his African birth, I think he's misunderstanding the real complexity of the way that Equiano kind of plays around between speaking of himself as an individual and speaking of himself as a member of a general collective. So when does that collective develop in this book? Well, one thing I have in mind is this book, Demonic Grounds by, let's go back, by Catherine McKittrick. And she writes in the course of this book, technologies of transportation, in this case, the ship, while materially and ideologically enclosing Black subjects, economic objects inside and often bound to the ship's walls, also contribute to the formation of what she calls an oppositional geography. The ship is a location of Black subjectivity and human terror, Black resistance, and in some cases, Black possession. So she's simultaneously talking about the actual Middle Passage of ships full of enslaved people being brought across the Atlantic. And she's also speaking of it as a kind of metaphor for understanding the Black experience and the creation of a Black consciousness, of the way that Black people thrown together in these situations create something that's a collective, something that's new out of that creates is an opportunity to create resistance and also, of course, their own culture. So I'm interested in that in particular, to think about where Equiano uses the phrase Black people for the first time. It actually comes up precisely when he's being sold into slavery to Europeans, when he's being put onto the ship and being taken across the Atlantic, or so he says. So when I looked around the ship and saw a large furnace of copper boiling and a multitude of Black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. This is the first point when he used the word Black people. We also see sable destroyers of human rights on page 51. Whites and white people also appear in that same section, 56 and 57. And you can read that passage itself. I think it's striking then that his recognition of himself as a Black person comes in the situation where he has been thrown together with other Africans in a condition of slavery that is actually born in the slave ship, this notion of a collective Blackness and of a collective oppositional whiteness. Both these things are invented for Equiano at this moment. And it's also interesting to me that he faints immediately afterwards. There's a sort of like real break, I think, in consciousness and the way that this book is operating. So countering that, prior to that moment of the description of Black people, we have the heterogeneity of African people in Equiano's interesting narrative. So we can look at page, this is 37 in the Penguin edition. Here's how he talks about some other Africans. Our markets are sometimes visited by stout mahogany-colored men from the southwest of us. We call them Oeibo, which term signifies a red men living at a distance. So there's a description of people who, he says, look differently from him. Page 38, I remember while in Africa to have seen 3 Negro children who were quite tawny and another quite white, who were universally regarded by myself and the natives in general, as far as related to their complexions, as deformed. And so here's an interesting moment where he's talking about skin color variations and talking about aesthetics in this case. And it's quite interesting to me that he says here is a person who he's calling a Negro who has white skin. That itself kind of indicates a real difficult paradox, I think. And we also have here on page 54 in the Penguin edition, a description of people who use scarification. You might remember this, of course, from the descriptions of Orinoco and Melinda in Offer Ben's novel. But above all, I was amazed to see no sacrifices or offerings among them, these people he's been sold into. In some of those places, the people ornamented themselves with scars and likewise filed their teeth very sharp. They wanted sometimes to ornament me in the same manner, but I would not suffer them. I didn't allow them to do it, that is, hoping that I might sometime be among a people who did not thus disfigure themselves, as I thought they did. Notice how he's marking his own sense of kind of cultural particularity and saying what is beautiful to them is ugly to me, and probably vice versa. But the interesting thing, of course, in these pages is that he doesn't use the word Black people or African people. That's not how he thinks of it. He thinks of it as a bunch of individual local cultures. And the notions of Blackness and whiteness don't become large collective terms until they are generated by the transatlantic slave trade, at least in this particular book. So we can also look later on this work and ask the question, who counts as a Black person? And Equiano is making some arguments about the possible Jewish origins of his particular people in Africa. So he's become Christian, he's become familiar with the Christian Bible, which includes the originally Jewish scriptures, and he's very keen to create a kind of Christian/Jewish ancestry for his people. That's understandable in terms of the kind of narrative he's crafting for himself. And in the course of that, he starts to raise questions about how it is that people become Black, because he's imagining, well, if Jews are light-skinned people, generally speaking, what about these Black people that I'm from if we originally have a Jewish ancestry? Well, he talks about climate difference. So he says, there are Spaniards who living in the deep in southern climates whose skin gets quite dark. He says, surely the minds of the Spaniards do not change with their complexions, are they not? And so he's saying the idea of skin color prejudice and thinking that says anything about, say, the intellectual capacity of a person or whether or not they should be enslaved by right, he says that's nonsense, because of course it's simply a matter of living someplace that's warm and sunny, and eventually people get dark skinned when they live there. He similarly talks about this in terms of the Portuguese in Sierra Leone, whose inhabitants are bred from a mixture of the first Portuguese discoverers of the natives and now become in their complexion and the woolly quality of their hair perfect Negroes, he says. So here again, he's sort of saying we can have people who are Black according to this idea of blackness and whiteness, who have become black quite recently within the last century or so. And does this mean that they are black people according to this whole logic of transatlantic slavery? Saying no, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't tell us anything about the inner capacities of a human being. And so he goes on to say here, a great many more of these might be added. They show how the complexions of the same person vary in different climates. It is also hoped they tend also to remove the prejudice that some conceive against the natives of Africa on account of their color. Surely the minds, as he says, surely the minds of the Spaniards did not change with their complexions. So there's a larger argument to be made here. One is simply the argument about the possibility of the Jewish ancestry of his particular people in West Africa. And the second argument has to do with what skin color tells us about a person. And Equiano is saying it's simply a natural process, raising questions about, he's effectively arguing that there's a way to think of Black people in a way that's completely removed from the political history that he's described in the middle passage. So that's what's interesting to me for the first section of this work is Equiano's self-identity and the question of his individual versus collective identity. And let me just turn it over to you now and ask you to write a little something for us to talk about on Tuesday, unless you're presenting, in which case you don't have to do this, but just find a paragraph that's interesting to you in the first several chapters of Equiano's interesting narrative, and just write a bit about what you believe its function to be. That is, I want you to kind of analyze it as a rhetorical occasion, as a work of literature, understanding Equiano is trying to accomplish something. Pay attention to how that paragraph is organized. How does it begin? How does it end? What kind of journey does it take to get there? And just write us up some talking points and send that to me, ideally before class on Tuesday, so we can use that just to talk about it. And thank you for listening today, and I will see you soon.